Hi everyone, today we are making pretzels. So if you love those soft, buttery, chewy pretzels, you are in for a treat because we are making hot buttered pretzels from King Arthur flour. The recipe takes a total of 1 hour and 10 minutes, but only 8 to 9 minutes of that is baking and about 20 minutes is prep. The rest of the time is just allowing our dough to rise. This recipe calls for only 5 ingredients, and they are bread flour, salt, sugar, instant yeast, and warm water. Now it calls for bread flour because bread flour has a higher gluten or protein content in it, which gives our pretzels more of a chew. If you don't have bread flour, it's okay to substitute all-purpose. The only difference is you may need to cut back on some of the water because all-purpose won't absorb as much water as bread flour does. Typically when you go to the store, you can purchase 2 different kinds of yeast, instant yeast and active dry yeast. This recipe calls for instant yeast, and the reason that it does that is it gives us a faster rise to our pretzels. Instant yeast creates a faster rise because it has smaller granules of yeast and can be thrown in directly with the dry ingredients. Active dry, on the other hand, are larger, more dormant granules of yeast, and you need to activate it first with warm water and some sugar for about 5 minutes before adding it into your recipe. If you don't have instant yeast at home, but you do have active dry, you can still make this recipe. Just go ahead and increase the active dry yeast to 2 3/4 teaspoons, and then add it into the recipe just as you would the instant. The final ingredient in this recipe is lukewarm water, and it calls for a range of 7/8 of a cup to 1 cup. Okay, so the difference there is about 2 tablespoons. And they recommend that you would want to use more in the winter and less in the summer, typically due to the humidity. You want to add enough water so that you have a nice, soft dough. In this recipe, King Arthur gives 4 different methods that you can mix and knead this dough. They include by hand, with a mixer, with a food processor, or in a bread machine. And since I typically use my mixer, I decided today I'm going to try out using the food processor to make my dough. This recipe calls for a straight dough mixing method, meaning that you just add everything together at once and mix it. To make the dough with the food processor, the process is to first add the flour, salt, sugar, and yeast and process it for 5 minutes to get it mixed. Then slowly add the water and process for 7 seconds until it all starts to come together. And then, instead of kneading it, we're going to continue to process it for approximately another 45 seconds. Okay, and that's it. So let's go ahead and take a look at our dough. Okay, so if you are using a stand mixer or you are hand kneading, obviously it's going to take you a lot longer, between 5 to 8 minutes. But with the food processor, it just works that much faster. And now I can go ahead and put it into a lightly greased bowl, cover it, and let it rise for 30 minutes. It has been 30 minutes and you can see my pretzel dough has risen quite a bit. While it was rising, I was making the topping. With the topping, you combine baking soda and hot water in a dish. And you're going to, after you make your pretzels, put them in this solution for 2 minutes before baking. And what that does is it allows for your pretzels to have a nice, beautiful, deep golden brown color when they come out. I also got my baking sheet ready, and I lined it with some parchment paper, and I sprayed it with a little pan spray to make sure that my pretzels don't stick. Obviously, if you don't have parchment paper, you could use it directly on the pan or even put down some foil. I have also preheated my oven to 475 degrees. And now I'm going to dump my dough out, and this pretzel recipe makes 8 pretzels. So you can just eyeball it if you want to look to have 8 equal portions. I'm going to use my scale. portioned my pretzels out into 8 lumps of dough. We are going to start shaping them into long snakes. And you want them to be longer than you would think you can make them, 28 inches. What I suggest too is that you're going to lightly grease your countertop. So often when working with yeast breads, people throw a ton of flour onto their counters. And not only does this add more flour into your dough, but with something like pretzels where we need to be able to shape it on the counter, if you put on flour, your roll of pretzel will just keep sliding along your counter instead of sticking and allowing you to make it longer. I want to allow my balls of dough to rest for 5 minutes. And the reason being is that if we tried to shape them right now, the gluten will start to pull back and you'll find every time you roll out your piece of dough, it'll keep shrinking. So the more that we can let our dough rest in between handling it, the better. What you want to do is start from the middle and kind of work your way out. If you find that something starts to pull back in and you can't really work with it, set it aside and start with another. Okay, so you can see some of my other ones when I started rolling them, they didn't really want to cooperate. In fact, this one broke. So just set them aside. And then you can always go back to them after they've had a chance to rest a little bit. But this one has rolled out nicely to about 28 inches. And so now I'm going to shape it into a pretzel. To do that, I like to make a U shape, cross them at the top, and then just bring it down. And then you can set it aside and you have a really nice pretzel shape. And after I've worked and made all of my pretzel shapes, I'm going to begin putting them into my dish with my baking soda and water. At this point, I have given all of my pretzels their water bath. And don't worry if they start to get misshapen. You can always try and fix the shape of them once they're on the pan. And even if they don't look right, they still will taste great. Okay, so you can see here are my pretzels. And at this point, you can put a topping on. It's totally up to you. I suggest having something like a coarse sea salt if you're looking for that traditional pretzel taste. If you are using a thinner grain of salt, make sure that you use much less than what the recipe calls for. You can also experiment with everything but the bagel seasoning. And I'm going to put some of this on my pretzels as well. Now that I've topped them, I'm going to let them sit for 10 minutes to continue their last rise before I put them in the oven.